Let's review some key takeaways from week 15, which focused on the policy change known as self-determination. We also got into a discussion of some significant issues facing Native Americans in the 21st century. As we work through this review, consider both the ways that Native cultures have benefited from self-determination policies, as well as some of the problems that self-determination policies have helped create. Consider also the ways Native groups continue to face barriers to equality despite several decades of a self-determination focus with regard to federal and state policies. Let's begin our self-determination discussion by examining community action programs. Federal officials began to issue grants directly to tribes beginning in the 1960s. These were managed by a different federal branch, the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO. Previously, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, administered all federal funds to Indians. However, the BIA administration had a poor track record with managing funds. This use of CAP grants represented a big change in policy. CAP grants sidestepped the BIA. Many tribal governments for the first time had direct control over substantial grant funds. Other federal agencies created direct connections as well, and tribes received funds for housing, education, drug control, police, tribal court management, and other anti-poverty initiatives. There are over 500 federally recognized Indian nations in the United States today, 200 of which are located in the state of Alaska. Others are spread across about 30 states. There are also some state-recognized tribes in the United States, recognized by state governments but lacking federal recognition. Most numerous of these among the states is California. Just like citizens of a U.S. state, tribal members are still subject to federal law. They operate under their own tribal constitutions. They administer their own judicial systems, and tribes develop self-managed tax and regulatory agencies. Tribes receive government-to-government status, and the federal government treats tribes much like it does states. Despite popular misconceptions about things like Indian casinos, most tribal governments today do not have independent sources of income. Few tribes have independent resources to start programs or economic development. Most tribal governments remain dependent on federal funding operations, similar to federal to state or state to municipality revenue sharing programs, rather than, as another popular misconception is that tribal governments are receiving welfare when in fact they're engaged in revenue sharing, much like state and municipal governments with other government entities. Most tribes have constitutions. Typically they're structured with 3 branches, much like the federal government scheme: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Often there's an elected leader, such as a chief, a governor, a mayor, as well as an elected tribal council. Tribes typically have their own tribal courts to hear violations of tribal laws. Federal criminal and civil courts supersede when there is conflict between various legal jurisdictions. Tribes with casino operations reported $27.1 billion in revenue in 2011. The regions with the largest revenues were the Sacramento region at almost $7 billion and the Washington, D.C. region with a little over $6.5 billion. Indian casinos and gaming operations employ over 250,000 people. About half the 564 federally recognized nations operate casinos of various sizes. Some tribes are indeed quite successful with casinos, but many others are not, and many Native American groups wind up being dissatisfied when they finally get, or if they get, gaming operations, because the dreams of sort of striking it rich don't materialize into reality. Casinos are large operations that are very expensive to maintain, and the idea that there is sort of a bottomless well from which to draw is sadly not the case. On the map on this slide, the states in orange, I don't know if you can read this or not, so I'm going to point it out. States in orange don't have any federally recognized tribes. The states in yellow are states with existing tribal gaming, and the states that are sort of beigeish or brownish color are states with a tribal presence that offers some form of gaming. Let's turn next to some major issues faced by Native Americans in the 21st century. We'll begin by reviewing the problem of the loss of languages faced by many Native American groups. Hundreds of indigenous languages in North America have already been lost, and out of an estimated 154 indigenous languages still left in the United States, half are spoken by a limited number of tribal elders. Many languages simply are not being taught to children, and this is one of those legacies of the cultural repression that occurred particularly in the early 20th century, late 19th century, where assimilationist policies were in place. To counter this shift to English among American Indians, some tribes have started language immersion in schools for children. In these schools, native Indian language is used for instruction. As we talked about in the textbook, or the text for this particular module, the Cherokee Nation has been particularly successful in its immersion model. Tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, are a key component in American Indian cultural preservation. They're located primarily in the Midwest and Southwest. You can see on this map the states that are in orange with green dots, the green dots representing TCUs. The states in orange are those that have a TCU, or at least one TCU. They service approximately 30,000 full and part-time students as of 2015. 8.7% of American Indian and Alaska Native college students attend one of the 32 accredited TCUs. That's a significant number, but it also helps maintain cultural identity for many of these groups. Archaeologists, natural history museums, and government agencies have acquired many thousands of Native American remains and cultural objects and have displayed them publicly for many centuries. There's significant controversy over the repatriation of remains. Pictured here is a guy named Ralph Glidden, who operated I don't know what you'd call it. He called it a museum here, Museum of the American Indian, but he was essentially a grave robber who dug up Native American remains and displayed them, and sometimes in very bizarre, almost creepy kinds of fashions. So he is an example of some of the problems that are associated with what I would call, I guess, funerary piracy. The federal government passed a law in 1990 to address this problem, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. Federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding must return under the law Native American cultural items and physical remains to descendants of these people, to culturally affiliated Indian tribes, also Native Hawaiian organizations. However, this only affects institutions that receive federal funding, and this may be less than 25% of the problem. We talked in the previous slide about Ralph Glidden, the California grave robber. Some institutions have used the courts to challenge claims by Native groups, which of course can tie up repatriation efforts and sometimes shifts the burden of proof, or the burden of payment, better put, on Native groups, who then must fund at least initial legal representation, or hope they can find a group to take their case. I sometimes have students who do not understand this issue. They look at Native American remains or cultural items, either in an actual institution or in pictures, and they struggle with understanding what the problem is. So I'd like to ask them the following question: how would you feel if you saw your great-grandmother's body or remains dug up and displayed in a museum someplace? And usually the proverbial light bulb goes on after this question, because then they can make the connection to why this is important. But again, we have in the United States a lengthy history of diminishing Native culture, of even dehumanizing Native Americans. So it's not surprising, I guess, that I should still encounter students who are puzzled by this particular issue. Another major issue for Native Americans in the 21st century is the continued use, especially in the United States, of Native American caricatures as mascots for team sports. And this is another issue that many students struggle to understand, why Native Americans would object to these things. I live in, and this course is being taught in Northwest Ohio, so there's a lot of Cleveland Indians fans around, and to them, images like Chief Wahoo are endearing. They've grown up sort of admiring the Indians logo and seeing the chief at the games. Cleveland, while it's refused to change its official logo, is certainly de-emphasizing Chief Wahoo, and there seems to be general consensus among Indian fans that they can see why that mascot might be seen as demeaning. But it's important to keep in mind that historically the emergence of these mascots occurred during a period of great repression of Native American culture. The banning of the speaking of languages, or the forbidding of use of languages in institutions like courts. We talked about some other forms of cultural repression in this course, like the banning of the ghost dance, or the banning of the use of peyote. So at a time when the United States was engaging in cultural repression of traditional Native American cultures and forcing assimilation upon Native American cultures, including the migration of their children away from the reservations into boarding schools, American culture began to use caricatures of Native Americans, and some were very insulting. Over time, if you look at a change over time in the use of Native American mascots, you're going to see increasingly, for the most part, that they become less obviously caricatures and less overtly insulting. So some of the difficulty in this issue for many American whites is they'll look at, for example, the Redskins logo here on this particular slide, and they'll say, well, this is celebratory. This is honoring, the warrior spirit, or something along those lines. They, of course, ignore the fact that the name itself is an insult to Native American cultures. the idea that you're associating race with these peoples. And of course, it's easy to counter that argument. Well, how many American sports teams use the white skins name or the yellow skins name or the black skins name, and they can pretty quickly come around to see why this particular one would be insulting. But some teams just refuse to change. I mean, the Washington Redskins, for example, are many of their fans are diehard supporters of that logo. Their current owner, Dan Snyder, has refused to even consider changing the name or changing the logo. So this continues to be an area of cultural conflict, and there are a lot of white Americans who simply refuse to consider the reasons why Native Americans might find these things to be culturally insensitive at best and overtly racist at worst. Finally, let's talk briefly about Native Americans' public health. We talked about some of the statistics in the reading this week. They have the highest rate of school dropouts, the highest rate of child mortality, highest rate of teenage suicide and teenage pregnancy, high rates of drug use and alcoholism, near the top, poor health care facilities on reservations, and frankly, very little desire by the federal government to spend more on native health care. For mainstream Americans, you only have to turn to the debate over the Affordable Care Act, popularly known as Obamacare, to see how little resolve there is for spending on health care in general among the mainstream American population. The idea that we should spend more on peoples who have historically been marginalized. And remember too that the drive for greater health care for Native Americans is going to come from those states that have higher Native American populations, many of which, if you think of Arizona or California, for example, have strong conservative movements that are going to be vigorously opposed to spending on a group like Native Americans. Collectively, we call Native Americans. That is the last review lecture of the semester. It also wraps up the course in some ways. Thanks to those of you who have been faithfully downloading these reviews or podcasts each week and watching them. And I look forward to reading the rest of your papers as well as reviewing the final exam so I can see how everyone did and whether learning outcomes were met to my satisfaction. But thank you very much for a great course, and I've learned a great deal from all of you. Have a great rest of your academic year, and I hope the rest of your exams go well for you.